In less than 2 weeks, the banknotes that have been in circulation in Nigeria for more than 20 years will cease to be valid. They're being replaced by trillions of new notes. But the move comes at a perilous time for the economy. With inflation at more than 20%, people are struggling to cope with the rising cost of living, as Mayeni Jones reports from Lagos.
I'm in a community called Amukoko in Nigeria's economic hub of Lagos. I'm surrounded by about 100, almost 200 women and children waiting for food from the Lagos Food Bank. And they say they've seen huge demand for their services since the price of food has escalated in the last year. In Nigeria, food is the biggest cause of inflation. It's what people spend most of their money on. So when the price of basic items goes up, that means they can't afford to spend money on anything else.
My name is Cordelia Fidelis Ukemebong. So I come to market almost every day, and the cost of goods is alarming.
She says in just 2 months, the price of yams has more than doubled.
Everything is so expensive. Crate of eggs is expensive. Beef is smaller. Palm oil is so expensive.
I am Mrs. Angela Chukwulozie.
So tell me, how have you adjusted your life now that food is so expensive?
I've cut down on my feeding and my family. Instead of eating 3 times in a day, I now eat twice.
At visa centers in Lagos, queues of applicants stretch around the block. Like many other countries, the Nigerian economy is still reeling from the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. But insecurity and policies limiting food imports have worsened things here. This is leading to the biggest wave of emigration in years. Reliable statistics are hard to find, but the number of Nigerians granted working visas to the UK has tripled since 2019, and 700% more British visas have been awarded to Nigerian students. A lot of those leaving the country are key workers, including nurses and doctors. The Nigerian Medical Association says at least 50 doctors leave Nigeria every week to go work abroad. It's a brain drain the country cannot afford, but unless the economic outlook improves, things aren't likely to get better.
Mayeni Jones in Lagos. Russia has accused Boris Johnson of lying when he said that Vladimir Putin threatened him personally. The two men had a phone conversation just before Russia invaded Ukraine, during which the former Prime Minister claims Mr. Putin said it would only take a minute to hurt him with a missile. More than 600 people have been charged with domestic violence in Australia following a 4-day police operation. Illegal weapons and drugs were also seized in New South Wales. From Sydney, Phil Mercer reports.
Some of the most wanted domestic violence offenders in New South Wales were targeted in Operation Amarok 1. More than 1,100 charges have been laid. Drugs and weapons, including knuckle dusters and swords, were seized. 1 in 5 Australians have reported physical or sexual domestic violence. The perpetrators are mostly men. The United Nations said the abuse of women in Australia was disturbingly common, but experts believe the scale of the problem is similar to other developed countries.
Millions of people in France are experiencing serious disruption as strikes bring a halt to the country's public services. A protest over proposed pension reforms has closed schools and hit bus and train services. The government wants to raise the retirement age to 64, arguing that the current system is no longer affordable. Polls suggest about 2/3 of the population oppose this. From Paris, Hugh Schofield reports.
Unfazed by the first day of mass protests, President Macron's government is pushing ahead with the pension law, which starts its passage through Parliament next week. 12 days ago, what struck many was the size of demonstrations not in the big cities like Paris, but in scores of smaller towns across the country. The government knows its law is unpopular, and it's hinted it is prepared to budge on some of the detail, but on the central and inflammatory issue of raising the age at which one can retire from 62 to 64, it says it will not give.
World News from the BBC. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, will travel to Ramallah in the occupied West Bank today for talks with the Palestinian President, Mahmoud Abbas. The meeting takes place a day after Mr. Blinken held what he called candid discussions with the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. He repeated the US view that a two-state solution was central to resolving the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. The US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has said the United States would come to South Korea's defense with nuclear weapons if necessary if North Korea were to attack. The comment comes as threats from the nuclear-armed North grow. Mr. Austin met his South Korean counterpart on a visit to Seoul, where there are concerns the US might abandon them in the face of an attack. Last month, the South Korean president said his country could consider developing its own nuclear arsenal if the threats continue. The NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg says he has precise intelligence that North Korea is supplying weapons to Wagner mercenaries who are helping Russia in Ukraine. The North has denied this. Ukraine's intelligence agency, the SBU, says it's arrested a man in Kharkiv who was supplying sensitive military information to Russian troops. The man had apparently been recruited by Russia last November.
Now, he was only voted into office over the weekend, but the new president-elect of the Czech Republic has signalled a significant change in his country's foreign relations. Petr Pavel won't be sworn in as head of state until March. He's already spoken to President Zelensky of Ukraine and was also due to make a phone call that's likely to anger China, as our Europe regional editor Paul Moss explained.
The Czech president-elect has said one of his first phone calls, he's going to phone the president of Taiwan. Now, Taiwan, as many people will know, an island off the Chinese mainland, which de facto is independent, but the rulers in Beijing have long said they will return it to Chinese rule peacefully or by war. And they're very, very sensitive about this. Not only do they not recognize the government in Taiwan, they don't want anyone else to. When the US speaker, Nancy Pelosi, went to Taiwan last year and met politicians there, China not only denounced the visit, they fired missiles into the sea just off the Taiwanese coast. But just to give you an idea how sensitive it is, when Gap made T-shirts which showed the map of China that didn't include Taiwan, China went mad and Gap had to profoundly apologize. There is no issue too small in this, no slight that China won't get very sensitive about it. So what happens? Petr Pavel is newly elected as the Czech president, not even in power. Does he call all his EU colleagues or NATO allies? No. Very publicly, he says he's going to call Taiwan's president.
So, as you say, very sensitive. Why has the Czech president-elect done this?
The Czech presidential election became, in the final round, between two men who represent profoundly different orientations to the world. There was Andrej Babiš, friendly to Beijing, not completely supportive of Ukraine and its resistance to Russia's invasion. At one point in the campaign, he said if NATO ally was attacked, he wouldn't want the Czech Republic to help them. He lost. Petr Pavel won, a man who has said he's very orientated, clearly towards democracy, not autocrats. And the Czech president, they haven't always had a lot of power, but they do speak out on foreign policy. The Czech Republic, very influential within Eastern Europe, having a president who has made it so clear which way he sees the future of his country, that will have an influence.
The Red Cross Federation publishes its annual World Disasters Report today, a look at how we coped with unexpected catastrophes and how we can better prepare for them in the future. Although 2022 saw a number of natural disasters, in this report the Red Cross focuses on one overriding concern, the disaster of COVID-19. Imogen Fox reports.
2022 saw devastating floods in Pakistan and drought bringing Somalia to the brink of famine. But in today's report, the Red Cross highlights COVID-19 as the biggest disaster in living memory. The pandemic has claimed at least 6.5 million lives. Industries have been devastated and jobs lost. No earthquake or hurricane, the Red Cross points out, has ever caused such massive damage. The report highlights how badly prepared the world was. Emergency measures such as lockdowns were imposed hastily by central governments, leading to a lack of trust among many people. There was glaring inequality over access to treatment and vaccines. To prepare for future disease outbreaks, the Red Cross says health inequality must be addressed and countries must establish local health and disaster response teams, people who live in and are trusted by their communities. Such preparation would, the Red Cross says, improve our response not just to pandemics, but to other disasters too.